December 25th, 1845. The Beaumont Plantation, Stafford County, Virginia. Snow falls like a shroud over the frozen fields, muffling the world in a deceptive peace. Inside the great house, firelight dances on crystal, illuminating the faces of 10 powerful men as they raise their glasses. A feast of biblical proportions steams before them, a monument to their dominion. But in the shadows, a different sacrament is being observed, its architect a woman whose name they barely know. This is not a celebration of birth, it is a meticulously planned funeral. The opulence of the table is a lie, the festive air a poison in itself, for this gathering is the culmination of 1,000 sins. The 10 men, masters, overseers, and merchants of flesh, are here to feast upon the fat of a land worked by broken bodies. They are unaware that the true reckoning for their cruelty is not in the hereafter, but already dissolving in the rich, savory broth before them. The story of this night begins not with a bang, but with a shattering silence born of a mother's grief. It is the story of how a soul, pushed beyond the limits of endurance, becomes a weapon sharper than any axe. To understand the cold, divine fury that guided Judith's hand on this hallowed night, we must first witness the sin that consecrated her vengeance. Join this chronicle, and let the whispers of the past tell their harrowing tale. Before we continue with the video, don't forget to subscribe. Before the fire of retribution was lit in her soul, Judith existed in the quiet rhythms of servitude, a ghost in her own life, her presence defined by the tasks her hands performed rather than the spirit that dwelled within her. Her world was a perpetual inferno, contained within the brick walls of the kitchen, a sweltering womb where she labored over the hearth's ravenous mouth. The air was a thick tapestry of competing scents, the wholesome perfume of rising bread and simmering molasses constantly battling the harsh chemical sting of lye soap used to scrub the floors and the faint metallic tang of blood from the butchering block. Her hands, perpetually raw and scarred, were a testament to this existence, a roadmap of burns from cast iron and cuts from careless knives. Yet, within this suffocating, circumscribed world, she nurtured a single, sacred light against the encroaching darkness, her 8-year-old son, Samuel. He was a piece of her own heart, living outside her body, a tangible soul she could hold. His laughter, rare and precious, was the only prayer she had left, a sound that could momentarily silence the endless hum of suffering. He had his father's eyes, the deep, soulful gaze of a man sold down the river before Samuel could even form his name. A wound in their family that never ceased to ache. His spirit, however, was entirely his own, a bright, untamed thing that had not yet learned the full dimensions of its cage. Judith's love for him was a fierce, silent rebellion, a clandestine war waged in whispers and shadows. In the stolen moments after dusk, behind the smokehouse where the scent of curing meat clung to the air, she would teach him the names of the stars, turning the vast, indifferent sky into a map of freedom. She gifted him the folklore of their ancestors, whispering stories of cunning rabbits who outsmarted powerful bears and patient spiders with wove destinies, the only inheritance she could possibly bestow. On the Beaumont Plantation, a place of stunning, cruel beauty where sweet-smelling jasmine vines slowly choked the life from ancient, mighty oaks, this small, secret world was their only sanctuary. Master Beaumont, a man whose corpulence was a direct measure of his avarice, saw his slaves not as people, but as entries in a ledger, assets whose value fluctuated with their health and obedience. Judith's quiet efficiency, her ability to produce flawless meals under crushing pressure, made her a valuable piece of his portfolio. Her obedience was a mask, a carefully constructed fortress built brick by silent brick to protect her son. For years she had absorbed the casual cruelties, the dismissive words, and the lingering, unspoken threat of violence like the parched earth absorbs a bitter rain, all for him. She believed that if she remained invisible, a shadow flitting at the edge of their awareness, she could keep him safe from the monstrous reality of their existence, a hope as fragile and precious as a bird's egg held in a trembling hand. The 10 men who would gather for that final feast were not a monolith of evil. They were a spectrum, each a different facet of a deeply corrupt and soul-destroying system, a constellation of darkness with its own unique poison. At the head was Master Wallace Beaumont himself, a patriarch of gluttony whose performative benevolence was a carefully crafted illusion, masking a heart of cold, hard calculus. His laughter boomed through the halls, a grand, theatrical sound that never once reached the shrewd, calculating chips of ice he had for eyes. He saw mercy not just as a weakness, but as an inefficient waste of resources. His cruelty was one of paternalistic indifference. He might praise a slave's work with a warm word one morning and order that same person sold south by evening, the decision based on nothing more than a shift in his ledger. Then there was Silas Croft, the overseer, who served as the physical embodiment of the plantation's brutality, the brutal fist to Beaumont's indifferent mind. He was the whip hand, a man who found a perverse pleasure in the sharp, percussive crack of leather on flesh and the guttural, soul-splintering sound of a human spirit breaking. His god was fear, and he was its most devoted and tireless disciple, his shadow falling long and cold across the cotton fields at dawn. Croft's violence was never merely for correction. It was a form of sport, a grim theater designed to affirm his own power in a life he otherwise viewed as unremarkable. Attending them was the Reverend Thaddeus Finch, a man whose piety was a weapon. He used the Holy Scripture as a cudgel, skillfully twisting the gospel of love into a divine doctrine of subjugation. He preached Paul's letters on obedience to the Master as an unassailable commandment, while conveniently ignoring Christ's teachings on the meek and the merciful. His sermons were a weekly dose of spiritual pause. Eisen, justifying the Master's sins with a holy veneer that cleansed their consciences and shackled their slaves with divine law. And completing this quartet of primary evil was Augustus Hemlock, a merchant from Fredericksburg who dealt in tobacco and human lives with the same dispassionate, elegant penmanship in his ledger. To him, Samuel was not a boy filled with life and wonder. He was a potential future asset, his value to be calculated in pounds and shillings, his potential for labor weighed against his cost of upkeep. The other 6, neighboring planters, a local magistrate named Thorne, whose gavel only fell in favor of the powerful, and a Dr. Alistair, who viewed his slave patients as livestock to be patched up for the field, were cut from the same blood-soaked cloth. They were men who built their legacies on the backs of others and slept soundly at night, convinced of their own inherent righteousness and superiority, utterly and willfully blind to the silent, ever-present witnesses of their every transgression. The shattering of Judith's world occurred on a frigid December afternoon, only 3 days before Christmas, when the air itself seemed to ache with the bite of winter. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow, and the fields lay silent beneath a brittle crust of frost. Samuel, her boy, restless and curious, had been driven by a hunger far greater than food, a hunger for a world that seemed forever out of reach. That hunger had led him to Beaumont's tutoring room, a place forbidden to children like him. From there, with hands trembling from both fear and longing, he had taken a small, worn primer, the kind that Beaumont's pale, listless children barely touched. To Samuel, the book was a treasure, a doorway. Behind the smokehouse, hidden in the shadows, he had opened it with reverence, tracing his finger along the sharp edges of a printed A, whispering its sound as though it were a prayer, a spell, a secret incantation calling forth freedom. It was Silas Croft, the overseer, who found him there, and in that moment, the world turned. There was no trial, no plea, no moment for mercy. Croft dragged Samuel into the yard with a kind of theatrical cruelty, hoisting the stolen book aloft as though it were proof of treason, a testament to unspeakable defiance. Master Beaumont stood on his porch, a glass of brandy swirling lazily in his hand, his expression blank, detached, almost bored. Yet when Croft looked to him for judgment, he gave the slightest of nods, so small it might have been missed, yet heavy enough to seal a child's fate. The punishment came swiftly, with a brutality designed not only to wound, but to humiliate. to destroy. Croft did not strike Samuel's back, but his hands, the very hands that had dared to seek knowledge. Each crack of the leather strap was a desecration, the sound echoing against the cold air. Judith was forced to watch. Her arms pinned by two other field hands, her throat burning with a scream she could not release. She became rigid, a figure carved from stone, her grief too vast for tears. With each blow, as Samuel's small bones gave way and his cries faltered into broken whimpers, something within Judith withered and fell away. What rose in its place was not life, but something older, darker, and unyielding. The fire of her spirit dimmed, replaced by the frozen emptiness of a still, unbroken lake. When at last they released her, and she knelt beside her shattered child, she did not weep. She simply gathered him into her arms, silent, her mind already etched with a decree written in blood and vengeance. That night, the sky was a cavern of black velvet, and within it hung a full, bone-white moon, cold and eternal. It hovered above the world like an unblinking eye, a silent and indifferent witness to human suffering, to the wreckage of one life among so many. Its pale light bled across the fields, pooling in silver shadows and casting long, skeletal shapes of the great oaks onto the frozen ground. There, at the edge of the yard, the earth still bore its stain, a dark patch where Samuel's blood had seeped into the frost, where warmth had fought a losing battle against the merciless cold. Every time Judith's gaze wandered toward that spot, she felt her chest tighten, as though the air itself were collapsing inward. Inside the cramped wooden cabin, the fire in the hearth had died down to embers, their dull glow barely pushing back the night. Judith sat on a rough stool, Samuel's small body curled against her lap, his bandaged hands cradled carefully in her own. He moaned softly in his sleep, tossing and turning, his face twisted with pain even in dreams. Each sound pierced her, but she remained still, silent, her hand smoothing his brow, though her own heart was splintering. The silence that filled the cabin was unlike any she had ever known. It was not simply the absence of sound, but something larger, something alive, pressing down on her from every side. It was the silence of the grave, of finality, the silence of a stolen future, of a love that no longer had a place to pour itself outward, and so turned inward, hardening, curdling into something unrecognizable. Grief had burned hot at first, a consuming fire that left her trembling, but as the night stretched on, that fire guttered out, leaving only a terrible cold. What replaced it was sharper, clearer, a crystalline shard lodged in her heart. She turned her eyes to the window, to the great house that loomed on the hill. Its windows blazed with warm golden light, and from within floated the faint echoes of laughter, music, the clinking of glasses. They were feasting. They were celebrating their power, their plenty, while her world lay broken. The moon bore witness as she sat there, and at last the tears came. They slid down her face, not in grief but in rage, a baptism in hate, each drop consecrating her resolve. And in that cold, merciless light, the idea bloomed. It was no wild thought, no reckless frenzy, but something deliberate, poisonous in its beauty. They had destroyed her son's hands. She would destroy them with her own. The roots and herbs she knew so well, the intimate trust she carried in their kitchen, these would become her weapons. Their Christmas feast would be her altar. Their joy would become her vengeance. The kitchen, which had long stood as Judith's cage, became something entirely different in the days that followed. It became her temple, a sanctuary of dark purpose. For years, she had labored within those walls, tethered to its relentless heat, its endless demands, its constant cycle of work and exhaustion. Yet now, the same hearth that had once mocked her with the roar of its flames seemed transformed. No longer merely a forge of drudgery, it was an altar, and upon its fire she would prepare her offering. The scent that drifted through the air, thyme, rosemary, sage, and bay, had always been the perfumes of servitude, but under her hand they became something else, a veil to conceal a darker promise. She moved through her tasks with unnerving composure, her every step charged with ritualistic intent. Her hands, once instruments of labor meant only to serve, had been remade into tools of vengeance, instruments of a high priestess officiating a grim sacrament. When she polished the copper pots, she did not simply make them gleam for her master's delight, she made them shine like malignant suns, each one reflecting back her unflinching resolve. When she drew the long carving knives against the whetstone, the harsh metallic rasp became a hymn, a song of sharpened anticipation, each stroke singing of inevitability. The other servants noticed the change. They did not speak of it, but they felt it, the way animals feel a storm before it breaks. They gave her distance, watching with wide eyes as the warmth that had once radiated from her vanished. The quiet kindness that had softened her presence was gone, replaced by a weight in the air, an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on everyone around her. She was no longer simply Judith, the cook, the mother. They sensed something had taken root in her, something vast and implacable. Her true source of power lay hidden in Tad, the small leather pouch she had secreted away for years in the chimney's loose stone. She had nearly forgotten it until now. Within rested a fine, white powder, arsenic bought long ago from a passing apothecary to kill rats in the smokehouse. Odorless, tasteless, remorseless, it now waited to serve a greater purpose. The only question that remained was the vessel. It had to be shared, a dish that would bind all 10 men together one final time. Judith's mind fixed upon it with chilling certainty. The rich, creamy oyster stew, a Christmas Eve tradition cherished by the Beaumonts, and a delicacy the master adored above all. It was perfect. In its silken cream, its fragrant sherry, she would weave her poison, a velvet shroud for death itself. Christmas Eve descended like a heavy curtain, its stillness broken only by the sounds of industry within the great house. The plantation was alive with anticipation, the halls glittering with evergreen boughs, ribbons, and flickering candlelight. But the true heart of the celebration pulsed in the kitchen. There, the air was thick with heat, steam, and the mingled scents of indulgence. The kitchen had become a maelstrom of motion, knives chopping, pots hissing, platters being ferried in and out in an endless rhythm. Yet at the center of that storm, Judith stood unmoved, her presence a cold, unyielding calm. She moved with an eerie precision, her body obedient to the tasks it had performed countless times, but her mind remained fixed, sharpened to a singular, terrible point. The fragrances rising from the hearth spoke of plenty, roasting venison dripping with fat, cinnamon and nutmeg braided into the sweetness of apple pies, pine resin perfuming the very air from the garlands strung across the house. To Judith, these were lies, a symphony of deception crafted to mask the corruption at the core of all that surrounded her. She worked as she always had, each dish prepared with flawless care, her hands moving in measured rhythm. This perfection was not a disguise, but part of the liturgy. The feast had to be immaculate, each detail seamless, so that suspicion would never darken its edge. Her vengeance would not be crude or clumsy. It would be exquisite, precise, a creation worthy of an artist, an offering cloaked in elegance and finality. When the hour neared, she turned at last to the dish that mattered most, the stew. She began as tradition demanded, rendering salt pork until the fat crackled, stirring shallots until they softened to translucence, whisking flour into the pan until it bloomed into a golden roux. She poured in the cream, rich and thick, followed by the share, fragrant and heady, then added the oysters, their flesh soft and pale as ghosts. Her hands never faltered, her expression betrayed nothing. At the pot's edge, she paused. The milky broth swirled, not as food but as a vision, an abyss yawning wide. In its depths she saw her choice, her sentence, her decree. Without hesitation she reached for the pouch, unwrapped the leather with steady fingers, and released the white powder into the ladle. She stirred slowly, methodically, until the poison dissolved, invisible, irretrievable. The stew was no longer a dish. It was consecration. It was judgment. The feast was sealed. The sound of sleigh bells shattered the stillness of the winter night, their bright chime mingling with bursts of raucous laughter as the guests arrived. From her station at the kitchen window, Judith observed their procession, the figures emerging from the frosty gloom like specters cloaked in wealth. Their heavy coats, black against the pristine whiteness of the snow, gave them the appearance of carrion birds descending upon a feast. The crunch of their boots on the frozen ground echoed in her ears, each step a drumbeat announcing the fate that awaited them. On the porch, Master Beaumont stood like a sovereign at his gate, his voice booming across the yard in hearty welcome. His words carried the weight of ownership, his tone dripping with the confidence of a man whose authority had never been questioned. One by one, the guests ascended the steps, each bearing his own history of cruelty, a ledger written in suffering. Magistrate Thorne was among them, a figure as rigid and merciless as the laws he enforced, a man who had condemned dozens of runaways to their deaths with the ease of swatting flies. Close behind came Dr. Alistair, physician to both master and slave, a man whose hands stitched the wounds of the enslaved with the same mechanical detachment he applied to treating his patron's gout. He, too, was complicit, his silence as damning as the lash. And there were others. Landowners, traders, men of standing, faces ruddy with drink and cold, their eyes alight with the smug certainty of those who believed themselves untouchable. They stomped the snow from their boots as they entered the great house, shadows stretching and distorting across the polished floors in the lamplight. Their voices rose in a cacophony, filling the halls with the brash energy of men secure in their dominion. They spoke of crops, of profits, of troublesome slaves and political affairs, their casual words laying bare the machinery of a world built upon stolen lives. In their own minds they were gods, enthroned in their small kingdom, masters of fate itself. Judith watched them with eyes like flint, her heart an immovable stone. Fear had no place in her now, nor hesitation. What she felt was larger, deeper, a chilling conviction that destiny itself had chosen her as its instrument. These men were not merely guests, they were a single beast, a 10-headed monster that had swallowed her son's future whole. Tonight, she would tear it apart. Tonight, their feast would become their undoing. The oyster stew was to be the first course, the ceremonial beginning to an evening of excess. It was tradition, a gesture of warmth and hospitality, a dish meant to ease the chill of winter and prepare the stomach for indulgence. When the dining bell rang, a clear silver chime that rippled through the house like the toll of a church bell, Judith felt something shift inside her. The sound marked the boundary between two worlds, the world of thought, planning, and silence, and the world of action, irrevocable and absolute. A stillness overtook her, deep and resonant, as though the very air in her lungs had hardened into stone. This was the threshold. Once she crossed it, there would be no return. She lifted the tureen from the counter, its porcelain body cool and smooth beneath her fingers. It was a beautiful vessel, adorned with delicate pastoral scenes, shepherds and their flocks dancing in painted fields, a bucolic vision of innocence that mocked the truth of what it now contained. Judith registered the irony with grim clarity. The tureen, fragile and elegant, was no longer a servant to feasting, but to fate itself. With practiced precision, she filled it, ladle by ladle, the creamy stew swirling within, steam rising in fragrant plumes. Its aroma was intoxicating. Briny oysters, sherry's sweet sharpness, the whisper of herbs. To anyone else, it smelled of comfort, of hearth and plenty, of celebration. To Judith, it smelled of graves. Beneath its surface swam not oysters, but the shadows of 10 men already condemned. As she arranged the tray, she was meticulous. The tureen stood at its center, flanked by a neat stack of warmed bowls, each one waiting like an open mouth. A basket of fresh bread completed the picture of abundance. But when Judith's eyes fell upon the silver ladle beside the tureen, polished to a mirror's shine, she caught her own reflection. What looked back? Look was not Judith as she had been, a weary mother, a silent servant, a woman bowed by grief, but something transformed, transfigured. The face in the metal was severe, implacable, the visage of an oracle or a fury. She was not acting within the laws of men, nor did she seek their justice. Her authority came from sorrow, so absolute, so consuming, it had ascended into the realm of the divine. She had become executioner and priestess both, clothed in the disguise of a humble apron. The bowls were no longer vessels for stew. They were funerary urns, waiting to receive the offering that would close the circle of her grief with death. The walk from the kitchen to the dining room stretched into eternity, each step echoing like a tolling bell, each footfall marking the inexorable approach of doom. Judith carried the tray as though it were an offering to some vast and unseen altar, her hands steady though her heart pounded with a rhythm so heavy it seemed to shake her bones. The polished heart pine boards gleamed beneath her feet, their lacquered surface reflecting faint shapes of light as though even the floor itself bore witness to what she carried. Every step forward was both a march and a countdown, the measured cadence of a destiny that could not be undone. The corridor was dim, lit sparsely by sconces whose flames sputtered in the draught. Along the walls hung the oil portraits of the Beaumont ancestors, men and women rendered in stiff postures, their painted eyes following her with unyielding severity. To Judith, they were not merely decorations but silent accusers, the very architects of the edifice of cruelty in which she had been trapped, the ghosts of the system that had crushed her son's hands and his future. Yet she did not grant them the dignity of her attention. Her gaze was fixed ahead, on the sliver of golden light spilling from the doorway at the corridor's end. As she drew closer, the sound of revelry swelled. Glasses clinked, low voices hummed with the satisfaction of men secure in their place in the world. Laughter erupted suddenly, sharp and cutting, a barking note she recognized as Croft's, thick with arrogance and cruelty. These were the sounds of a realm utterly apart from her own, a world that thrived on her silence, her obedience, her grief. She pressed the door open with her hip, the polished wood swinging easily, and the dining room unfurled before her eyes. The men sat in comfort around the massive mahogany table, faces flushed with wine and firelight, eyes glinting with appetite and amusement. The room itself was dressed in the trappings of abundance, garlands, candles, polished silver, a grotesque parody of piety and joy. Candlelight transformed their wine into glowing rubies, while shadows played across their features, masking the corruption etched beneath their skins. Judith moved among them like a specter, her face an immaculate mask of servitude, her eyes lowered in perfect mimicry of obedience. She set each bowl before them with fluid, unerring grace, her hands never faltering, her body a vessel of practiced invisibility. They did not see her. To them she was as insubstantial as the chair legs, a piece of furniture performing its function. Only she knew the truth. With every ladle of creamy stew, fragrant and rich, she poured not nourishment but judgment, not food but finality. The bowls before them were no feast, they were chalices of damnation. The meal began with the chiming rhythm of spoons dipping into porcelain, the soft, almost reverent sound of men indulging themselves without a thought for consequence. Master Beaumont was the first to taste, raising the steaming bowl to his lips and savoring the flavor with a self-satisfied hum. His eyes half closed as he leaned back in his chair, his voice swelling with smug approval. "Judith has outdone herself," he proclaimed, as though his judgment was the only truth that mattered. His tone was thick with entitlement, his words a benediction over the table. "The best oyster stew in all of Virginia." The declaration was met with nods and murmurs of agreement. Spoons clattered softly against bowls, and soon the men were immersed in their feast. Their conversation resumed seamlessly, flowing over the poisoned meal as though it were a river running toward its inevitable end. They spoke with ease of the New Year's prospects, of land to be acquired, of crops to be expanded, of the machinery that would wring more labor from already broken backs. Augustus Hemlock, puffed with pride, boasted of a recent transaction, the sale of a family of slaves, a mother torn from her children, his tone as casual as if he were speaking of livestock. Reverend Finch, face flushed and eyes gleaming sanctimoniously, raised his hand to offer a blessing, thanking God for the bounty laid before them, blind to the bitter irony of his words. From her station by the sideboard, Judith watched in silence. To anyone else, she appeared the perfect servant, still, patient, ready to refill a glass or fetch a loaf of bread. But in truth, she was something else entirely: witness, judge, and executioner. Her eyes moved from face to face, recording each detail, each careless display of arrogance. She observed the choreography of their hubris, the way they puffed themselves up, how each man's boasts fed the next, and their voices layering together into a chorus of invincibility. Silas Croft ate with the same feral hunger he had shown when wielding the strap against Samuel, his spoon clattering against porcelain as he devoured the stew with relish. The poison, hidden and silent, gave no sign of its presence. It slipped into their bloodstreams like a shadow, a seed buried in rich soil, invisible but inevitable. Judith alone held the knowledge of what was coming. The room buzzed with laughter and talk, but beneath it all stretched an invisible tension, a wire strung taut, vibrating with the certainty of approaching calamity. For long minutes, the only sounds were the scraping of spoons and the confident, oblivious voices of the damned. The first sign was almost imperceptible, a thread in the tapestry of merriment that only Judith was attuned to see unravel. It was Magistrate Thorne who faltered first, the man renowned for his iron constitution, a body tempered by years of excess and cruelty. He paused mid-spoonful, his throat issuing a dry, rasping cough. He reached for his glass of water, swallowing deeply, but his brow furrowed in a flicker of unease he quickly tried to mask. Judith's eyes narrowed, noting the tremor in his hand as he set the glass down. Moments later, the second thread snapped. Augustus Hemlock, the merchant whose boasts had filled the table with callous laughter, dropped his spoon with a sharp clatter against porcelain. A sheen of sweat glistened suddenly upon his ruddy forehead, incongruous in the chill of the winter evening. He tugged at his collar with impatient fingers, his face twisting with discomfort. "Indigestion," he muttered, attempting a weak chuckle, though the sound fell flat against the rising tension in the room. The sickness spread like a ripple, subtle at first, then undeniable. A chorus of coughs echoed around the table, one after another, as if an invisible hand had passed over them, plucking at their lungs and stomachs with cruel precision. Their bodies betrayed them one by one, and the illusion of control began to crumble. Dr. Alistair, whose profession demanded detachment, leaned forward, his eyes darting from face to face. At first, there was curiosity in his expression, the clinical interest of a man observing symptoms. But when his own chest tightened, when a violent cramp seized his belly and forced him to clutch at his midsection, that curiosity dissolved into horror. His voice, strained and hoarse, forced the truth into the air. The stew. Master Beaumont, the master of the house, rose half from his chair, his face blotching into shades of red and purple. He tried to summon authority, to impose his will upon his own body, as he always had upon others. His chair scraped violently against the floor, his hand gripping the table for balance. "What is this?" he bellowed, but the command collapsed into a strangled croak, the sound of a man discovering the limits of his dominion. The atmosphere curdled in an instant. Where there had been laughter and self-assurance, now there was confusion, panic, and the sharp edge of fear. The men, who only moments ago had strutted like gods in their domain, turned on each other with wide, terrified eyes. Their fortress of power, so impregnable in their own minds, was collapsing from within, undone not by armies or rebellion, but by a silent, invisible enemy swimming through their blood. This is the moment history holds its breath, an act of vengeance so absolute it becomes a myth at the instant of its birth. The air in that room crackles with a terrible, righteous energy, a reckoning foretold in the silent tears of 1,000 broken souls. Here, in this grand hall of hypocrisy, a servant becomes a god, and a feast becomes a final judgment. The story of Judith is not written in the ledgers of men like Hemlock or the sermons of men like Finch. It is a story carved into memory, a legend whispered in the dark. If you believe such stories of impossible courage must be told, that the echoes of such righteous fury deserve to be heard, then let your voice join the chorus. Subscribe to this chronicle of defiance, and share this fire with those who still sit in the cold, so that the legends of the truly brave may never be extinguished. Let her name be remembered, not as a footnote, but as a testament to the fire that sleeps in the heart of the oppressed. The room erupted into chaos, the transformation so sudden and violent, it was as though the walls themselves had been torn down. What had moments before been a tableau of wealth and order, now dissolved into a grotesque carnival of suffering. The veneer of civility, so carefully polished, cracked wide open to reveal what lay beneath. The raw, animal terror of men unprepared to face their own mortality. Reverend Finch, who only minutes earlier had loftily invoked God's blessing upon their feast, began to pray again. But now his words were no sermon. They spilled out in a frantic torrent, a babble of half-formed psalms and broken pleas, the desperate ramblings of a man who had never offered mercy to others, but now begged for it himself. His trembling hands clawed at the tablecloth, upsetting bowls and silverware, before his body lurched forward. His face landed squarely in his plate, silencing his supplication forever. Silas Croft, the overseer whose cruelty had defined Judith's life, fared no better. His bellowing voice shrank into pitiful whimpers as his throat seized against the invisible fire devouring him from within. He clawed desperately at his neck, as if he might tear the poison free with his bare hands, his eyes bulging with a primal terror. A gurgling retch escaped him as he toppled from his chair, crashing to the floor. There, on the rug imported from Persia, he convulsed, his limbs jerking in spasms, his body a grotesque marionette pulled by the strings of death. His end came not as the tyrant he imagined himself, but as a helpless, writhing beast. Around the table, the scene unraveled into further madness. Wine glasses shattered, their ruby contents spilling across the table and dripping onto the rug below. The scarlet liquid mingled with vomit and bile, turning the once pristine room into a grotesque canvas, a physical manifestation of the corruption that had always rotted beneath their wealth. Master Beaumont, the patriarch, tried to rise above it. He staggered to his feet, his massive frame swaying, one hand outstretched toward the door as though he might summon aid, might command some loyal servant to save him. But his authority had no power here. His bulk, once a symbol of dominance and prosperity, betrayed him. He stumbled, collapsed forward, and his head struck the marble hearth with a sickening crack. His reign ended not with the dignity of power, but with a pathetic, hollow thud. The air was filled with the cacophony of the damned, retching moans, the crash of chairs and tables toppling. It was no longer a dining room, but a theater of ruin, a symphony of a world ending, its final notes shrill, broken, and unholy. Into this maelstrom of death and ruin, Judith stepped forward. She did not creep like a thief, nor flee like a guilty woman fearing retribution. Instead, she moved with the steady grace of inevitability, her figure cutting through the chaos like a blade through fog. The once invisible servant, so long dismissed as little more than a fixture of the household, now emerged as the silent arbiter of fate. Each step carried a weight far heavier than the polished floor beneath her could bear. It was the tread of history itself, of long-buried grief made flesh. The men who could still see through the veil of their agony turned their eyes toward her. Recognition flickered across their contorted faces, dim and belated, like the last sparks of a dying fire. The servant they had never truly seen, never once acknowledged as human, now stood at the center of their downfall. What they beheld was not triumph, nor cruel gloating, but something far more terrifying. Judith's face was a mask of stillness, her expression emptied of every trace of warmth, love, or anger. What replaced it was serenity, an eerie calm that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of the mortal world. She had become more than a woman. She was judgment given form. Dr. Alastair, the man of science, found himself stripped of every tool, every fragment of knowledge that had once made him powerful. He lay gasping on the floor, his lips stained with froth, his hand trembling as he tried to raise it toward her, his finger pointed like an accusation, though his voice, broken by spasms of blood and air, could carry no true weight. "You," he managed to rasp, the syllable torn from his lungs, a single word, and in it all the disbelief of a man who could not fathom that someone beneath him had risen to strike him down. His final question emerged as little more than a hiss of air. Why? Judith's reply was quiet, unshaken, spoken with the same steady cadence she might once have used to announce a meal. She looked at him with a gaze as distant and cold as starlight. For Samuel, she said. The name lingered in the poisoned air like smoke from a dying fire. It was no argument, no justification. It was a verdict. Samuel, the boy they had broken, had become their executioner through her. In that single word, they were condemned. It was more explanation than they had ever given to those whose lives they destroyed, and it was all the epitaph they would receive. Silence, thick and heavy, descended upon the dining room. It was no longer a hall of celebration, but a grand, opulent tomb. The fire in the hearth crackled and hissed, its light casting flickering, monstrous shadows from the contorted shapes of the dead and dying. The smell of death, sharp and acidic, mingled with the lingering aromas of the feast, creating a nauseating perfume of retribution. Judith stood amidst the carnage she had wrought, a solitary figure in a landscape of her own creation. She did not touch anything. She simply observed her work, her eyes moving from one fallen master to the next. She saw not men, but symbols, the glutton, the brute, the hypocrite, the merchant, all brought low, their power revealed to be as fragile as their own flesh. There was a profound, terrible peace in the silence. It was the first true peace the house had known, a quiet born not of oppression, but of conclusion. For a long moment, she allowed herself to feel the stillness. She had not brought her son back, but she had balanced the scales. She had taken their world and broken it, just as they had broken hers. Her task was complete. She turned, without a backward glance, and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the sudden, vast emptiness. She did not run far. She went back to her cabin, to her son. She sat by his bedside, holding his good hand, and waited. She knew there would be no escape, no new life. That was never part of the plan. Her future had been sacrificed the moment Croft's strap had fallen on Samuel's fingers. Her final act was one of motherhood, of quiet comfort in the dark. The discovery came at dawn, when a house slave, terrified by the unnatural silence, peered into the dining room and let out a scream that shattered the morning. The ensuing chaos was swift. They found Judith in her cabin, calm and waiting. There was no struggle, no denial. When they dragged her out in chains, she held her head high. Her trial was a formality, her sentence a foregone conclusion. But as she stood before the men who condemned her, she was no longer just Judith, a slave woman. She was an event, a terrifying legend, born overnight. Her stoicism was her final act of defiance. They could chain her body, they could hang her from a tree, but they could not touch the core of what she had done. She had become the author of her own story, and its final chapter was one of martyrdom, an ending she met with the same chilling serenity with which she had served the poisoned stew. In the official records of Stafford County, the incident at the Beaumont Plantation was recorded as a tragic, inexplicable case of food poisoning, with a lone, crazed slave woman hanged for the crime. But history is not only what is written, it is what is whispered in the dark, from one generation to the next. Among the enslaved communities of Virginia and beyond, the true story was told. It became a myth, a dark gospel of retribution. They didn't speak of Judith as a murderer, but as an agent of divine reckoning. They called it the Feast of Justice, the Christmas when 10 masters received their final terrible communion. Her legend became a source of secret strength, a reminder that even in the deepest pit of despair, a seed of vengeance could grow. The great house of the Beaumont Plantation eventually fell to ruin, but the echo of that night never faded. It became a timeless whisper on the winter wind, a solemn and mythic testament to a mother's love, an unbearable injustice, and the terrible righteous poison that grew from a broken heart.